How's it going, DRMB? I'm Tom itself, and I've got a commentary for you today about game types and map design. Specifically, you've probably noticed that there's this weird thing between Rush and Conquest, and that a good map for Rush is not so good for Conquest, and the other way around. Yeah, I know it's console gameplay, and Battlefield 3 is my first Battlefield. I got a few hours into it at this point, just a few. But this is a trend I notice a lot, and I've heard some other people mention it, so I want to talk a little more about it. First, I'm going to say there are some fairly significant differences in the game types, though, obviously, but Rush tends to pull people in towards those MCOMs because they know where the action is, they know where the objectives are, and they know what they have to do, and the defenders actually have to set up to defend. Whereas in Conquest, a good close Conquest game where both teams are running all around the map trying to capture the points, you may not run into a whole lot of other people because you're more worried about capturing the control points for your team rather than trying to defend them or trying to go out and just kill the enemies. So the action ends up very, very spread out in a Conquest game. Alright, and so that's not because of the maps, that's because of the game types. That's the way they encourage you to play to try to win. So the maps for these game types, Rush tends to be very linear. Even within a single zone, a lot of them can be extremely linear and just a straight push back and forth between the offense and the defense. And oftentimes the offense will get some additional vehicle support. Think Grand Bazaar, Dam Van Peak, where the offense gets a vehicle advantage, but again the defense only has to win one base to win the game. Whereas in Conquest, because it's more about capturing flags than killing people, a linear map is, well, it works, but it's kind of odd because it puts the focus on killing people rather than trying to get around and capture the flags. Maybe that's an odd thing to say, I don't know, maybe you don't agree with me there, but that's the way I see it. The other thing about Conquest is that both sides get roughly the same amount of vehicle support, and so it's easy for both teams just to sit there and push up against each other in a small choke point that you might have for a Rush map, where on Rush, one team would have a vehicle advantage that hopefully would let them push through. And so in Conquest, you can usually be more concerned with flags than killing people, and so if you're in that situation, if you can take a flank around and get behind the other team, that's the thing to do. But in a Rush map, that's not so easy, so it seems that maps can either be good for Rush or good for Conquest, at least in general, and that making them good for both is kind of a challenge. And so I'm going to go out on a bit of a limb here and say a lot of the maps don't know what they want to be good for. Since it's so hard to be good for both Rush and Conquest, a lot of maps end up kind of trying to bring elements that would be good for both sides, and in the end it's not really so good for either. What can I say? You end up with a map that's very confused about its identity, not sure what it's supposed to be doing. And yeah, kind of a Frankenstein with an F2000 and a motion sensor. My god, if I could set up this class I would be invincible, but it appears to be just a bug. So I want to spend this commentary to take a minute to sit back and think about what makes a good Rush map, what makes a good Conquest map, and how could you fit them into the same map. Now we've already seen DICE be very flexible in limiting zones, in changing some barriers, and opening up some new areas of maps between game types to make it better, to try and make it better, but they haven't quite succeeded in a lot of cases. I want to sit back and think, where can you get the same kind of action that you do in a Rush game, but still get the same kind of big experience you do in a Conquest game? So let's first talk about Rush maps, very linear Rush maps, like a Dam Van Peak or Metro. I really enjoy playing those on Rush, but for Conquest, well, they're kinda linear. And you end up focusing a lot on the push back and forth, trying to kill people, where the thing that usually decides the game is the ticket bleed, and so controlling 2 points is kind of the thing to do there. Again, you're just not going to kill enough people to counter the ticket bleed, so that it ends up being so focused on that linear push back and forth and killing people, it gets, I don't know, it's not the best for Conquest. On the other hand, you've got maps designed more for Conquest, where each team has a large base with lots of vehicles that they need to use to try to get to the fight. Maps like Caspian Border, for example, Karg Island, and they take up the entire area that the entire Rush game would. And one of the good things about these larger maps is that it's harder to spawn trap because, well, in a pub game, spawn trapping, not so great. It leads to a not so interesting game. Now, of course, the downside of having a base that's difficult to get spawn trapped into is that it takes quite a while to bring your vehicles up most of the time. And if you have to respawn in your base and go a long way to get back to the action, well, that's going to take a while. Either be quite the drive, maybe even have to wait for a vehicle, or a really good run. So, yeah, I understand the importance of giving the other team an advantage if they're able to wipe squads. However, in Rush, you don't get the flags to spawn back in on. So, it can mess with the pace of the game quite a bit. And finally, one big issue I have with Conquest that I just do not know how to address is that a lot of times enemy teams don't know where the enemies are, don't know where to go to get a fight, or which points are going to be contested. So oftentimes it's best just to pick an enemy point to try to go contest and capture. And oftentimes you end up not running into any resistance, and the game type ends up being pretty slow and kind of boring. At least that's my experience on console. What you're watching is some Rush on back to Carcan, and this is one of the maps that I think plays fairly well, at least on console, for both Rush and Conquest. That's actually kind of funny because the Conquest version has 5 flags, whereas so many maps, even some of the big ones like Firestorm, only have 3. And you'd think that with only 3 flags, especially lined up linearly as to push back and forth between the two teams, that it wouldn't be hard to find people to run into, and you would keep the pace of the action going. But that's actually not the case, because without lots of points to control and be able to spawn in on, people end up having to spend quite a long time trying to get back into the fight. Now, yes, I happen to be on a squad of friends all the time that knows exactly what they're doing, and we manage to never get wiped, unless we want to get wiped to go get a vehicle or something. But it's as much a problem for the enemy teams because, well, yes, it's great, we just got a squad wipe. Now we have to wait for them to come back in from their deployment, and that really slows the pace of the game down and makes it less interesting. Oh god, the building just collapsed I was standing on. Now let's face it, how often do you see scrubs manage to make full squads of 4 so that they have the maximum number of people to respawn in on? And not very often. Not very often. So I guess what I'm getting at is the distance from the respawn to the objective. That's something you need to pay careful attention to, DICE, because having it be really far means the pace of the game gets slowed down to something painfully slow. So this is an argument to consider, at least putting a 5 flag Conquest on maps like Firestorm. Yeah, I don't know what you do with Dam of Peak though, because the map is already so linear. But let's talk about a map that's not so linear, Grand Bazaar. It's weird how Rush loops you all the way around the map, and it plays kind of odd for it, but at the same time, it at least kind of works for both game modes again. And maybe not great, maybe not your favorite map, but at least it's better than something like Op Metro. I know people like Op Metro, and I understand why, because you get to kill a lot of people, but at the same time, in the interest of the game type, it's not so hot. Now, there is an option that I'm kind of curious as to why DICE hasn't explored, and maybe they have, maybe they figured out it didn't work for them, but that is, instead of having the flags lined up between the two bases, so that each team basically has a gimme flag and then they fight over the one in the middle, and if you don't control your gimme flag, you're probably spawn trapped, or maybe they're just pushing in from behind you. Why aren't the flags spaced equal distant from both teams' bases, so that at the start of a game, both teams can contest any of the flags they want to? And you say, well, you know, then everyone wouldn't be fighting over one flag. But at the same time, it might be harder to spawn trap, which, again, in pub play can be kind of lame. I assume the reason it's set up like this is because we're playing on maps that were also made for Rush. And as a whole, Rush is a very linear game type. You move from one zone to the next. With Carcan, what it does is it spreads it out a little bit more, makes it a little harder on the defenders, but it keeps it an interesting Conquest map. We talked about Grand Bazaar, how the Rush route, while it's kind of narrow, it loops around the entire map. And then Conquest makes use of all of it. It's kind of an interesting thing to do, and wow, it makes for some really intense infantry combat. But I think my biggest issue with Conquest a lot of times is that it simply plays too much like Rush, as a constant push back and forth between two teams. And when it's not that, you're just looking around for something to do, solo capping flags, and not really sure where the action is. Or, to put it another way, Rush is about giving the attackers the advantage, be it vehicles or just the nature of the map, and each team trying to spawn trap the other, and then you bleed out the other team's tickets or arm the MCOMs and keep moving forward. That's and Conquest, well, spawn trapping, I guess competitively, that's the thing to do, but in pubs, it's generally to be avoided just because it makes for fairly dull games. So as challenging as it is, I think that Grand Bazaar has the right idea in that the traffic patterns between Rush and Conquest are completely different, because they are very much different game modes. A good push back and forth in Rush is great. A good run around the map, try and get behind the enemy team all the time is great for Conquest. And so blocking off areas, opening up new routes is the way to make that happen so that the same map is playable on different game modes. Oh, anyway, those are just a few of my thoughts on trying to make Conquest and Rush work on the same map. I know Conquest is kind of the Battlefield standard, but Rush seems to play so much better in Battlefield 3, at least for me. Anyway, take these as the musings of a crazed console player, or whatever have you. But I want to thank you guys for listening, thank you for sticking around, and I'm interested to hear your comments on these topics. So please leave your comments below. I also want to thank DRMB for uploading this video. I also have one up here from back in the Squad Rush PTFO tournament you might want to check out too. And finally, feel free to stop by my channel and check that out. Again, thanks guys, and I'll see you later.